So whatever your company is doing, they're following a process. So the first thing we have to do is figure out what is the process. So the first thing we're going to do to make sure that we understand our process is we're going to define the boundaries of the process. And those are the supplier and customer relationships. The picture that they show you here is really a more detailed version of that SIPOC diagram that we talked about before, where it was suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. In this one, they've added a little bit more information about the key stages in the process, and they've talked about what are the quality characteristics of the inputs. So how do we know that something that we're getting from somebody else is of sufficient quality? And what are the quality characteristics of the outputs, to make sure that what we're building meets the customer's requirements for quality? So when we're defining the process, the first thing we should be careful about is to make sure that we involve a lot of different perspectives. Every process has a lot of different people that interact it either directly or indirectly. And each one of those people has a different perspective. And we want to capture all of those perspectives of what is the current process. And the other thing is we should use the people who are actually executing the process to define what the process really is. A lot of times management will have a different perspective, kind of an ideal of what they think is going on. We don't want to capture what we think is going on. We want to capture what is really going on. And that leads to the second point here. We don't want to define what the process should be. Whether we have listed a process or not before, there is a process. And so we should capture that process, and then we can work hard to make that process better. But if we don't know our current state, any change is going to be abrupt and very risky. Once we have a definition of what the process is, then we have to make sure that everybody does it the same way. If we let different people do the process in different ways, that will lead to variation in the results, and that is lower quality. At this book, the standards for how to manage a process and I are going to disagree with what this book says. The book says some improvements will be obvious and you can start working on them right away, and I don't really disagree with that. However, they also suggest that we could replace the process wholesale with how the process should have been designed from the beginning. That is a fundamentally risky activity. Whether you think the process should be something, you have no idea for sure whether that process is right. And changing the process wholesale means changing the way people do the things that they do, which is going to lead to mistakes and frustration and delays. So replacing the process wholesale is very risky, and I have never advised anybody to do that. So instead, once we have the process defined, then we want to identify opportunities for improvement. And one of the ways to do that is to look for complexity, because we'd like to reduce complexity wherever we can. And the other thing to do is to think about what happens when one step of the process fails. How long do those defective intermediates exist? How long do we keep working on them after they're broken before we realize that they're broken? What happens if the stuff coming in from the customer doesn't meet our requirements and we don't catch it? So one way to look for opportunities for improvement is to look for what happens when things go wrong. I've added 2 extra videos to Chapter 2. One of them is about ISO-9000, and that's a standard for what an engineering process should achieve and how it can achieve it. And the other is CMM, which is the Capability Maturity Model, which are stages of maturity in managing processes. And at this point, what you ought to be able to do is you ought to be able to look at the steps in this chapter and see how they correspond to the stages of maturity in the CMM. And then you should also be thinking about, if you're looking at the things that are in ISO 9000, how would ISO 9000 help you identify places where you could improve your process?